So today we are discussing the existence of God. And this is one of the Bible's statements and few statements the Bible has on atheism, to which the psalmist writes, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." Before I get started, I want to go ahead and say beforehand that I've used many resources and I've listened to many things throughout my life. So if I say something and I don't cite it, and you say, I think I heard that before, you probably did. So John Frame's Apologetics and the Glory of God, that book. Greg Bahnsen's Debate versus Gordon Stein. There's a podcast that I listen to called Logical Apologetics. James R. White and Robbie. But Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 10, verses 4 through 5, "For our weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ." So that is our goal here. Our goal is to not only, in communicating apologetics and evidence of God, it's not merely just us telling other people things. It's also God working within us, that we are going to take our thoughts captive. And especially I want to emphasize once more that we're going to take our pride captive, that we're not going to make it about what we know or how smart we are or how much we've figured out or how we're different from other people, how we're better than other people because of what we know, but rather we're going to humbly submit to the knowledge that God has given to us. So getting started, some of my preliminaries. I'm purposely not going to make these arguments as complex as they're made in philosophical books, because I don't think they need to be that complicated. And additionally, we're here in a church and we're not in a philosophy classroom. So sometimes Christian philosophers err in that they allow a non-Christian philosopher to make arguments without considering the basis for the arguments whereby that philosopher made those arguments. Now, those are called presuppositions. Those are starting points in a point of argumentation. It's where you begin. And so what this does, this allows the unbeliever to then argue against them in such a way that they contradict the consistent assumptions that they have in their life. See, they're allowed to make an argument, but the necessary preconditions are not accounted for in their worldview. Now, I'll get into this just a little bit more. But what I'm saying here is that someone will make an argument, and then what they're arguing towards within their worldview is not supported by the worldview that they are arguing towards. It's kind of like in The Wizard of Oz, where you had the Wizard of Oz, and he was creating all the fire and the flame, and there was the man behind the curtain. And he's like, never mind the man behind the curtain. Well, that's what's happening when someone doesn't want you to think about the presuppositions that they're bringing forward that contradict their worldview. They're saying, well, don't look at the man behind the curtain. See, I believe that only the Christian worldview can successfully accomplish this. Additionally, arguments are often dismissed because they cannot explain everything about God. See, but I want to make this clear, and I want us to understand this as we go through these points. That is not the point. See, they're merely just pointing out an evidence for God, right? They're not pointing out every single evidence that is possible about God. That's not necessary. Just because an argument doesn't explain everything on a particular subject does not mean that that argument does not explain anything. So I believe an argument can be made for God, but I don't believe that any single argument is an automatic slam dunk that will immediately end all discussion. Now, the one that comes closest to this is the transcendental argument, but the transcendental argument merely shows that apart from the true God, we can't make any sense out of anything, including the laws of logic, which is exactly what we use to determine what makes sense. So John Frame has the following quote: "An argument should not be criticized because it fails to prove every element of Christian theism. Such an argument may be part of a system of apologetics which as a whole establishes the entire organism of Christian truth." So the existence of God is clearly evidenced throughout creation, in the mind of man, and in abstract truths. So what I'm arguing here is the existence of God is clearly evidenced throughout creation, in the mind of man, and in abstract truths. But God is very complex, and so are the workings of God. So there's no law that says that God must be completely proven throughout one argument. And I'm focusing on this because this is one of the major contentions against some of these arguments, is that someone will grab just one thing and say, well, it doesn't prove this. Well, that's not the point. See, the lack of evidence to the contrary is something that should draw everyone to the Christian worldview. The complete contradiction that exists within the naturalistic worldview and the contrary ways of life to the believers is something that men are going to have to give an account for on the day of judgment. So my point is that within the naturalistic worldview, you have viewpoints which someone will hold to in explaining the whole system of the universe and the whole system of epistemology. That's the idea of thought. However, they don't hold to those views in the smaller parts of their life. So this is an example that I want to discuss. And this is, raise your hand if you've ever heard this metaphor before. It's the blind man and the elephant. Normally this is used to discuss the idea that all religions talk about God. So they would use the illustration of the elephant with the blind men to say that all religions point out a certain aspect of God, and then they don't quite have the whole picture, but then ultimately that's a picture of God. Well, I think that's foolishness, because religions are contrary. So you have one religion that's pantheistic. You have one religion that argues that there is a non-personal force that controls everything, and then you have another religion that argues for a triune God. So all of those are not just examples of blind men holding on to an elephant. What I do want to use this metaphor for is as examples of arguments for God, because I think that's what we have within argumentation for God. We have different aspects and different pictures that we see throughout these arguments. And when you put all of those arguments together, it is completely obvious that there is an elephant in the room. Although one may not prove all aspects, when you look at all of these together, it's very clear. It's very clear that there is an elephant in the room. See, the greatest evidence that I think of this truth and of these arguments is that everyone uses them in some way in their life. And our problem in that these arguments that I'll discuss is that we are not consistent in our use. A man will stand by an argument or a truth when it's useful to him, but then he'll deny it and he'll stifle it when he wants autonomy in his sin. So many non-Christian philosophers will belittle these arguments, saying that they can be defeated on their own. They will argue that they are all leaky buckets. See, they'll point out something in the argument that the argument does not prove, and they'll declare, therefore, since it didn't prove this, it can't be true. See, but that's not the point. My point is I agree, none of these are going to stand up on their own. None of them are going to stand up in and of themselves, but together they are going to make a strong argument, and they're going to make a strong argument which no other worldview on earth contains. Some have criticized this, and I think it was Anthony Flew, who said that if I have 10 leaky buckets and I put them all together, it doesn't give me a solid bucket. However, that's not the case. If the buckets were placed together properly, they would contain water. It's not unreasonable that they could be placed together in such a way so that the sides of each bucket contain the water so it did not leak out. So who are you to say that if 10 leaky buckets hold water, that it doesn't count because you didn't only use one bucket? I'm not approaching this study merely as a philosopher. I'm approaching this study as a theologian who is working within philosophy. I don't believe philosophy can exist within a vacuum. There's always going to be an ultimate source of authority to whom the philosopher looks to as the foundation of his beliefs. Some are going to look to impersonal, self-existing laws. Others will look to their own minds. But for this study, I'm looking to the eternal triune God for the basis of all of the evidence. So my point in making these arguments is not to do so in such a way that I'm proving to someone who is completely ignorant of God that there is a God that exists. I am proving what people are suppressing. People are suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. But you may say your arguments seem like a classical apologist. You seem like a classical apologist who's seeking to prove God with the understanding that man is truly ignorant. But I'm here to say that's not what I'm doing. I'm saying that you cannot make sense out of the world around you without a knowledge of God. So when I speak of the cosmological argument, I'm saying that you can't make sense out of the reason for the universe's existence without a knowledge of God. When I argue for the teleological argument, I'm arguing that you can't make sense out of the order of creation from the micro all the way to the macro without God. When I argue for the ontological argument, I'm saying that without a knowledge of God, you have no basis whereby you can base your understanding of truth. When I argue for the epistemological argument, I'm arguing that you cannot properly account for your ability and your mental faculties to correspond to the world around you apart from God. And lastly, when I argue for the transcendental argument, I'm saying that apart from a knowledge of God, it is impossible to make sense out of laws such as logic, which are abstract and universal, without a knowledge of God. So when we talk to people, we're not talking to people who are completely ignorant of what I'm saying. Unbelievers do believe that effects have a cause. That is the whole basis of science. Unbelievers do believe that existence of order gives evidence of a mind behind that order. When someone sees a building, they believe that it was designed and built by people. People do have an ontological basis for their understanding of the world. The problem is it's usually within themselves, and that's contradictory, because we do not all have our own truth, and neither does anyone live their life as though they do. Unbelievers recognize epistemological truth in the world around them, and they recognize that the world corresponds to their understanding in their mind, but they are not able to account for this within the naturalistic system. So we see this picture, this hypocrisy that exists within an unbeliever, because they live their lives affirming to the truth, but within their belief they contradict it. And that's in Romans 1:18-22. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. But people do this every day. They do not acknowledge God, but they use the creation of God. They don't acknowledge God, but they use the creation of God. So how do we make sense of this? What it means is that people are liars and they are God-haters. They're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. And so it is our job through this argumentation to demonstrate the inconsistency with the goal of directing them toward the gospel. We want to show them the inconsistency of how they are living their life and what they claim to be true, with the goal of pointing them toward the gospel, which is the only hope that will save them from the impending judgment of God, whose truth of which they are suppressing. So our goal is to point out the contradiction in what they normally believe as compared to what they are saying is true. And I want to use this example of Jesus when the Pharisees come to him and ask him about paying taxes. It's in Matthew 22, verses 15-22. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his talk. And they sent disciples to him along with Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? And they said, Caesar's. Then he said to them, Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard this, they marveled, and they left him, and they went away. So in this conversation, they tried to trick Jesus by asking him about whether or not they should pay taxes to Caesar. So if he said they should pay a tax, they would pin him up against the Jews. If he said they shouldn't pay the tax, then they would pin him up against the governing authorities of the Romans. So first off, let's recognize that their goal wasn't to find out the truth about taxes. But the irony is that the people who were asking this question were using coins with Caesar's image. By using the coin, they already acknowledged the authority of the person who was on that coin. So how can they then argue that Caesar doesn't have the authority to make them pay when they're using the coins that have Caesar's image upon it? But you might say, they didn't have a choice. Caesar ruled over them. That's the money that they were given. See, that is irrelevant. That may be true, but it doesn't eliminate the contradiction. They really don't have a foundation to stand upon, and Jesus is pointing out the contradiction. So that's the basis of all of our argumentation toward the existence of God. Men use God's creation, they acknowledge its order, but they then use God's creation and the order to argue against God. They end up with an argument that has its feet firmly planted in thin air, and they have a life that contradicts this argument. The man who walks through life accepting the truths of cause and effect, the mind of a designer and the design, using his mind and how it corresponds to the world around him, and also utilizes abstract laws which have not been based in the natural world itself, is like the Pharisee who asked Jesus if he should have to pay taxes to Caesar. All the while, he has been going through his life buying and selling with coins that have the image of Caesar. As soon as you use the coin, you are recognizing the authority of Caesar. As soon as you participate in the truths of God, which are evidence of God, you are recognizing the authority of God, and you're showing yourself to be a hypocrite. And you have no choice as a member of this creation to acknowledge these truths in some parts of your lives. Because if you don't, you are irrational. So that is the basis of my argumentation. Now let's get through the individual arguments. The first argument is the moral argument. The fact that moral laws exist is evidence that there is a lawgiver. The fact that moral laws exist is evidence that there is a lawgiver. Moral laws are something that everyone lives by. I mean, pretty much almost everyone agrees on morals. Even laws of idolatry are agreed upon. See, but what someone claims to be idolatry all stems from whatever that person claims to have the greatest source of authority. Everyone has something to which they claim is their greatest source of truth. If that is anything other than God, then according to the Christian worldview, you are an idolater, and additionally, you are logically inconsistent. We saw this in the Ken Ham-Bill Nye debate, when Bill Nye would continually go back to the argument that if students believe that there is a God, they would not be good scientists. Of course, he didn't offer any evidence for this, and it was contradicted by Ham's examples of scientists too held to creation, but that was Nye's main concern in the debate. However, he may not have realized it, but he was making a moralistic statement. And the worldview that he has, the naturalistic worldview, could not account for that moralistic statement. I mean, Christians agree that we should explore science. We agree that humanity should be blessed through those discoveries. But Christians have a basis for saying that. We have a loving God who has blessed us with the creation. But what basis did Bill Nye have for his argumentation that we should raise up more scientists? Why is that the unforgivable sin for Bill Nye? See, science was his God, and to stifle science was to commit heresy in his book. Even if you didn't necessarily stifle science, if he just thought you were, or he thought that you might, that was heresy to him. But even beyond that, why do we have morals? And why do people generally follow them? The fact that we have morals are that lying is wrong, stealing is wrong, adultery is wrong. See, people everywhere know that these truths are wrong. And the fact that we know them, and this knowledge is spread throughout societies, is evidence that there is something beyond us. See, morals don't just tell us a set of facts. They tell us what should or should not happen. They tell you what you should or should not do. They tell us what we ought to do But the question that I'm asking is why? See, I can tell you that 2 + 2 = 4. I can demonstrate that. I can tell you those facts. But facts don't tell you what you ought to do. What you ought to do is found in morals. The problem is not that people do not believe in morality. It is that they oftentimes use an improper ultimate source for their morality, and also that they're inconsistent in their use of morality. And by that I mean that they will use morality when it is useful to them. However, they won't use it when it's not. And what is ironic is that we even know that doing that is wrong. We frown upon hypocrisy. I mean, isn't that supposedly the number one reason why people don't want to go to church? Because it's full of hypocrites? But tell me this, if there's no lawgiver, why is hypocrisy wrong? Christianity can tell you that hypocrisy is wrong because you were made in the image of God and you are charged to bear God's image, and it is contrary to the character of God to be a hypocrite. But why, in an atheistic worldview, is hypocrisy wrong? I don't think you can argue for this. If no one else knows, how can an atheist argue that anything is immoral? The existence of morals is evidence of a God, because without them, society would fall into turmoil. And those who seek to live by anarchy, those who seek to live without morality, are soon going to be ruled by tyranny. That's the consistent flow in history. And so you may say, well, the tyrant just enforces those moralistic principles because they work, and they are necessary for the success of the society. So therefore, he just enforces them because they're in his interest. So I don't disagree with that. I'm not arguing that it's not in the best interest of even Napoleon to enforce certain rules of morality. But my question is why? Why is morality so ubiquitous, and why is it necessary? Why is it something that the tyrant finds necessary for his survival? I don't deny that people are inconsistent in the morality, but the fact remains that the morality is ubiquitous. And I argue that the existence of morality is evidence of the mind of God and the imprint of his moral law placed upon the hearts of humans. And the reason for the inconsistency in our morality has its basis in our fallen nature. I think one of the greatest evidences of this truth in the moral argument is the trial at Nuremberg. As many Nazis stood in trial, they were charged with crimes, and they would plead that they were merely following orders. Additionally, they would argue that what they had done was done in accordance with German law. See, but no one was happy with that answer. Who cares if you didn't break German law? It just doesn't feel right. There has to be a reason why it is wrong to kill so many millions of people. See, of course what they did was wrong. We all know that what they did was wrong, but can we all explain why what they did was wrong? Are naturalistic explanations of this as to why it's wrong logically consistent? So let's consider some of them. If morals are merely a social construct, then it would have been immoral for the Nazis to defy the laws of the land. But you know that's not right. That would argue that their actions were correct, that they should have been applauded. And everything inside you says that that is wrong, that can't be right. Others will argue for morals in the naturalistic viewpoint from a utilitarian perspective. And from that, they will claim morality. They will claim that right and wrong should be determined by what is most helpful to the most people, or what can make the most people happy. See, but that can't be right either. Suppose that more German people were helped by the Holocaust than were hurt. Or suppose more people were made happy by the Holocaust than were made unhappy. Would that then justify the Holocaust? Your heart tells you that something is wrong. It has to be wrong. It doesn't suffice just to say, well, it's just wrong just because it is wrong. So why do we know that what they did was wrong? Because there are transcending moral laws that are given by God. And even if a country passes a law that is contrary to the law of God, then those laws are immoral, and so are the people that follow them. You may say, well, maybe we had international laws that made it illegal. Well, what if the international law made it legal? Would that have made it right? What if you were living on a space base on the moon? Would that make it right? No. It's a transcending law that tells you that the Holocaust was wrong, and the only basis for this moral law is in a transcendent God. Next argument, the epistemological argument. How do you make sense out of your knowledge of the world around you and the fact that it corresponds to the world around you? So this is the point. You have a mind, all right? So how is it that you can explain through a naturalistic worldview, not only that you have a mind, which is amazing, but that your mind is able to correspond to the world around your mind, and that the world around you corresponds to your mind? How is it possible that the human mind correlates so well with the structure of the world so that people can make sense out of the world? That's a quote from John Frame. See, it's hard enough to swallow the idea that life just sprung into existence out of nowhere. But naturalism claims that life not only sprung into existence out of nowhere, but that it also gave the mind the ability to perceive the world around it, and for the world around it to correlate in the mind as reality. But what is amazing is not merely that our mind is able to properly correspond to the world around us, we are also able to experience a great depth of experiential understanding in the world around us. And that is not explained by evolution. So by that, this is what I mean. It is not justified merely on the basis of the survival of a species. And that is the whole basis for which the evolutionists give an explanation for all of our mental faculties. But it is explained. It is explained by a loving creator who desires to communicate himself with the creation. With a loving creator who desires for his creation to bear his image. So I can tell you why the world normally is understood by the human mind, because God blessed us not only with the creation, but also with the ability to perceive and experience the creation. But here are the points that I want to bring up that the naturalist has no explanation for, because normally the explanation is something the species needed something so it would adapt and so it would change and so it would grow. But there are things for which that we experience regularly, daily in our life, which were not necessary for our survival. So the first of these I want to consider is the question of why is there beauty? These are rhetorical questions. Why do we have such an array of colors? And not only do we have this array of colors, I mean, you can say that beauty might have existed for survival reasons. But why? Why, when I look here, is the sunset beautiful? Why is the ocean beautiful? Why is nature filled with so much diverse beauty? And why are we able to interpret and to enjoy this beauty? See, that doesn't have an explanation from a naturalistic viewpoint. But if there is a God who made this creation for the enjoyment of man, and did it to communicate himself and his attributes with man, then we have a reason. How about flavors and taste? Have you ever noticed that God gave us food? He not only did he give us food, but he also gave us food that has flavor. Not only did he give us food that has flavors, he gave you the ability to perceive and to interpret all of those flavors. See, there's not a naturalistic explanation for the abundance of flavors in the world. Sure, you may say, well, maybe this doesn't taste good because it's not good for you, and this tastes good because it's good for you. Well, that's not explanation enough for all of the diversity that we have within flavors. However, if there's a God who made the world for our enjoyment, and he desired to show his glory through his creation to his creation, then that is completely consistent. Why is there humor? How is humor to be understood from a naturalistic and an evolutionary point of view. Humor does not serve in survival. However, if there's a God who made his creation for the enjoyment of his creation, then it makes complete sense. So what about the existence of desires that cannot be fulfilled within this creation? Why is it that nothing on earth will ultimately fulfill our ultimate desires in life on earth? It's true that people are happy in their sin, but it's also true that people are equally miserable in their sin. And if anyone is honest, who has ever reached a material goal that they have set for themselves, once you achieve that goal, it's never quite as great as you thought it was going to be. The writer in Ecclesiastes writes in verse 5:10, "He who loves money is not satisfied with money, nor is he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity." See, only a proper understanding and relationship with our Creator can we have an understanding of this empty desire. C.S. Lewis says this: if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in the world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. My next argument is the teleological argument. The psalmist writes in Psalm verse 8, verses 3 through 4, "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you're mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him?" So the teleological argument argues from the idea that there is fine-tuning and order in creation, and that fine-tuning and order is evidence that there is a God. So the question is, why am I here? What is my purpose for being here? See, these are two questions that serve as a foundation for all of life. Without a proper answer to these questions, life loses all meaning and it becomes irrational. When the finite seeks to find significance in the finite, it's a downward spiral towards foolishness and insignificance. So if my whole purpose in my existence is found within myself, then I am insignificant because I'm finite. I'm not eternal. I cannot be, I am not infinite. The finite cannot find significance in the finite alone. But the irony is that we do find significance in the creation around us. There is significance there. The question is, why? And the answer lies in the fact that the creation points to the one that is greater than itself. And we see this greatness and this wisdom demonstrated in the order of creation, which the psalmist just pointed out. How do we account for all the order and the design that exists within creation? How do we account for the ability of this planet to be perfectly set up for life? Will you look at time plus chance? If you do, you're inconsistent with the way that you normally live your life. Why is it consistent to accept design in the majority of your life, in the majority of the things that you see, but then ignore the existence of design in the creation and in the universe as a whole? It's not just here, all right? It's throughout the creation. The order in creation cannot be explained by creation itself. An apologist named Saitim Brudicade makes the following point. He says, I don't need to show you evidence for God. You know there's evidence for God. He says he has a pump in his chest that pumps 180,000 gallons of blood a year. And that pump is fueled by donuts. So within this, we have not just that, but we have numerous evidences that exist for God. Charles Darwin made the following point that I've always found fascinating, and he writes this in the appendix of his book on the origin of the species. He says, "To suppose that the eye, with all of its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correlation of spherical and chromatic aberration, it could have been formed by natural selection seems, freely I confess, absurd to the highest degree." So what he's saying in English from 100 years ago is that when he's looking at the eye, he doesn't see how it could have evolved slowly, gradually, through time and chance. What Darwin's discussing in the macro, that's the big, we're now seeing evidence, especially within microbiology. And this term is known as irreducible complexity. And what this argues is very similar to that which Darwin is arguing against in his own system. Evolution makes sense, and it seems logical until you begin to deal with the facts. You deal with the facts that contradict the assumptions of the argument. So how do we account for things in creation that cannot be explained by gradual mutations over time? What if the mutation would have been a hindrance in its mutation prior to its current form? What he saw in the eye pales in comparison to what scientists see within the human cell. In biology, you'll learn about things called simple cell organisms. But when you study them, you'll realize they are not simple. They're extremely complex. How does evolution explain the great complexity in these cells? Through gradual time. Gradual change over time is not an explanation for what is happening within these cells. This can only be explained through design, through the mind of a creator. The contrary is foolishness. And normally it would be ascribed to fairy tales. So if I told you that a prince turned into a frog, you'd tell me that I was telling you a fairy tale. But if I told you that a prince turned into a frog over 1 billion years, you might say, well, that's science. See, but the existence of time is not an explanation for the design. Next, I want to go to the cosmological argument. The Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. See, the existence of the universe is evidence that there was a cause for the universe. That's the cosmological argument. Beginnings are important because they give you insight into what something is and how it got there. The cause for something's existence cannot just be brushed off easily. It should not be ignored. And it definitely should not be ignored when you're talking about something as grand and as great as the universe. David wrote, "The fool says there is no God," and you'd have to be foolish to say that there's no reason for considering the cause for everything that is in existence. Scientists spend years trying to figure out the reasons for little things in nature and things that happen in disease. But is not the existence of everything even more incredible? Can that be so easily disregarded? See, I believe such reason is anti-academic and anti-reason, and it ultimately leads to irrationality. One of the goals of scientific study is to study why. What causes one thing to make another thing happen? Scientists assume a cause when they see an effect. However, when it comes to the beginning of time, naturalistic atheism has taken over scientific study, and it outright ends all conversation on this subject. The naturalistic worldview says that a Big Bang created the universe, but from what did the stuff come from that went bang? See, you didn't answer the question, where did everything come from? You just took a step back. And additionally, why is saying that something just blew up and made the universe an explanation for how the universe got here? It only explains that the universe was in a prior state prior to its current state. So suppose you asked me, where do frogs come from? And I say, frogs come from tadpoles. See, am I really describing where frogs come from? No, I'm merely describing the state in which the animal existed prior to its current. I haven't explained how frogs came into existence because we know that tadpoles are not eternal. They have not always been here. So I say, they were tadpoles previously. And you say, well, then where did the tadpoles come from? And then I say, it just is. The tadpole's always been here. See, but that's illogical. If the tadpole had always existed, how can you argue that it could have changed? How can anything that has always existed, that is eternal, that is transcendent, how could it change? See, the universe had to have a cause, and the Big Bang does not explain this existence. So there's two main arguments that I'm going to focus on in the cosmological argument, and I'm mainly going to focus on the first one. And this is the Kalam cosmological argument. Kalam was a Muslim scholar from about 1,000 years ago, and he came up with the following argument for God from the existence of the universe. And he says, all things that begin to exist have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. God is the only explanation for this cause, therefore God exists. It comes to this conclusion because the universe exists within a series of events. One event leading to another, and then another, and then another. Therefore, if we follow the series of events back to the time, we would either find that the universe had always existed, or we would find that the universe had a beginning. So, since it's logically impossible to have an infinite regress, that means that it's continuing to exist over and over and over and continuing to change, we know that the universe had a beginning. So, since the universe had a beginning, someone had to create that beginning. And that someone is God. Some will argue against this by either saying the universe has always existed, or that just because something caused the universe doesn't mean that it was God. And additionally, someone else named David Hume argued that, well, just because maybe God made the universe, it doesn't mean that he's still in existence. But if the universe had always existed, it would have existed in every possible form of existence during this time. Since the universe is changing, if it's always been here, it's going to be continually to change. And if it's always existed, it's going to go through every possible change that could have existed within that time, which is forever. See, the problem with saying that the universe could have always existed is contradicted in the fact that the universe changes. If something changes and it has always existed, it is possible that it could go through every possible form of its existence. And one of the possible forms of the universe is non-existence. Therefore, if the universe had always existed, it would have at some point not existed. Additionally, something cannot bring itself into existence. Something outside of the universe would have had to have brought the universe into existence. So here's a couple of proofs for this argument. Another Muslim scholar from about the same time period said, suppose the universe had always existed, and Jupiter had circled the sun once for every 2.5 times that Saturn circled. Therefore, every year Jupiter and Saturn would go around. Jupiter would go around once, and Saturn would follow 2.5 times. However, if the universe had always existed, since this would have been occurring since infinity, they would have really only circled the same amount of time. If they'd always been doing the same thing, they would have circled the exact amount of time because they had been doing it infinitely. But see, that's absurd. That's absurd because you know that they're not equal. The one is traveling around the sun 2.5 times as much as the other one, so they could not have gone around the same amount of time. It's illogical to say that the universe has always been in existence. Another law that we have is the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says that all matter moves towards a state of entropy. Therefore, all of the heat and all of the energy is eventually going to burn out within a closed system. So secondly, the point there is, if it had always been existing and it had been infinite, that we would be at a point where there's no energy within the universe. There would be no heat left over. Well, the mere fact that there is energy and there is heat and things are burning and things are moving is evidence that it hasn't always been here. Secondly, according to the second law of thermodynamics, it states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. So it could not have come from itself. Additionally, how do you account for all of the energy that exists within the universe? So you look at some of the stars in the universe, and if they were placed at the center of our solar system, they would reach to the point of Saturn's orbit, burning and burning and burning. So much energy, and that giant is just a minor fraction of the energy that exists within this universe. Additionally, this giant star is moving. It's not just standing still. Something put that giant star into motion, and along with it, every other piece of matter that is in the universe is moving. So where did all of that energy come from that not only put all of this energy into existence, but also has moved all of this matter around as it does continually? Where did all the energy come from? It didn't just make itself. That would contradict the second law. It's not just there. That's a cop-out. It hasn't always existed. Whatever brought all of this into existence and sent everything into motion is greater than everything that is there. And additionally, I want to lastly consider in this argument David Hume's argument that God might no longer be there. And I want to consider the absurdity of this statement when I just talked about the magnificence of the universe and the amount of energy and everything that creates there, and that the person that brought this into existence is greater than the universe itself. But then we would say, perhaps this great God is no longer there. How does that make sense? That would have made what the God made greater than himself if the universe continued to exist when he did not. That is foolishness. The next argument is the Leibnizian one, and I'm going to quickly go through this. Anything that exists has a reason or an explanation for its existence. It has its explanation for existence either in itself, which he calls necessary, or within something else, which is called something as contingent. He argues the universe is contingent. Therefore, the reason for the universe's existence is in another necessary being, and that necessary being is God. The Leibnizian argument for cosmology stems from the idea that the universe had its existence in something else other than itself. And that leads us to the question is, what is the cause that we have for information? Dr. Lyle pointed this out, that the existence of information is evidence that there is a mind behind that information. In order for information to be useful, you would need a sender and you would need a receiver. The information must exist, and the information must be significant in order to someone or something else in order for it to be information. So how do you account for the existence of information in the universe without an initial sender and without an initial mind whereby this information came from? Have you ever considered the amazement of DNA? It is informational code for life on Earth. It communicates how bananas, elephants, and people are all made without thought. DNA just does. It just acts. And there's no evidence whatsoever in creation that information ever comes from non-information, much less to the degree and to the scale with which DNA operates. How do you explain personality? The existence of personality argues against both atheistic naturalism and also against impersonal forces. This idea that you could have an impersonal force that brought everything into existence. So I have something that's non-personal that created personalities. That's foolishness. That would make the creation greater than the creator. How can we explain the creation of personality outside of the personal? And so we are not going to cover everything. Let me go on. Let me quickly go through these ones. This is the ontological argument, and this comes from Anselm, and it was mentioned in other theologians prior, Augustine, some others, but that for which no greater can be conceived. And so Anselm describes God in this ontological argument of that to which no greater can be conceived. Without God, we have no standard whereby we can determine what is perfection. Our knowledge of these truths of Christianity can hold together because of a Christian worldview. However, the argument falls apart in other religious worldviews because they're either logically inconsistent internally or they're inconsistent with reality itself. Therefore, the ontological argument only further supports what we already believe that is true. So the ontological argument comes forward and it pops up more as a contradiction in its absence rather than itself as a statement of truth. It's more like the binding of a book. See, I don't have to prove that a book has a binding. I don't have to prove that a book binding exists because it's evident in that the pages are bound together. And if you don't have a book binding, it's going to be obvious because your pages are going to be scattered throughout the table. You might say, I don't believe in book bindings, but look, my pages are all held together. Then I say that you must have a binding to your book. What is it that is ultimately holding those pages together? Someone may say, well, I hold them. And I would say, sir, then your pages will be a jumbled mess. Someone else may say, they just do. They just hold themselves together. That's just how it is. But I say, no, they don't. Either you stole your binding for those pages from someone else, or your pages are going to be a jumbled mess. You cannot claim that the pages merely hold themselves together. So therefore, this argument for the ontological has a transcendental bent to it, because without God, it's difficult to have assumptions that are necessary for life. When you don't believe in the ontological argument, you have a problem. You have no ultimate basis whereby you can judge any truth against. You have a basis, and you'll find that basis in yourself, even if you say that you're merely judging the truth outside of yourself. So it's easy to understand how a Christian scientist might understand the scientific method. The question that remains is this: how is it upon the naturalistic and atheistic scientist accounts for his belief that the present is going to be like the past? See, a naturalistic view believes that order came out of disorder. Therefore, how in this worldview can you assume that the universe will not suddenly break into disorder again? Why can you account for all of these scientific laws? And you can't account for them. You just accept them and you use them on a daily basis, and you don't accept any regard as to whether or not they are true. And the last argument is the transcendental argument. And this is one that has been flowing throughout all of my arguments. And it's without God, we cannot account for abstract laws. And one example would be logic. So if there's no God, knowledge is not possible. And so we would argue knowledge is possible. That's obvious. So therefore, there is a God. The transcendental argument argues for the existence of God from the impossibility to the contrary. The transcendental gives an account for all other arguments and knowledge that we have. So it's often used and tied to the laws of logic. So for instance, we all would agree that I cannot say that my wife is here in this room and that she is in the kitchen. That's illogical. It wouldn't matter what planet I was on, what side of the universe I was on, those would not hold true. So although an atheist and a Christian might both agree that that is true, the question is why? How do you account for logical principles? How do you account for abstract thought that is not tied within the creation itself, which transcends the creation? How do you account for morals that existed earlier? How do you account for the uniformity that we see? This is not a convention. Logical laws are not just merely a convention of nature. It's not just something people use where I could be in this country and I can be logical, and then I can go to another country and I can not be logical. Just like we talked about morals earlier, there is something that is transcendent to this. Others might say, oh, it's just a chemical impulse in your brain. I think Doug Wilson uses this example, and he says, suppose I had a bottle of Dr. Pepper and I had a bottle of Mountain Dew, and I shook them both up really, really hard, and I opened them up. Would you say one of them is true and one of them is false? Well, that would be foolishness. So how do we account for this idea, this epistemological idea, this understanding of knowledge that we have truth and we have things that are not true? There is something that transcends, that gives an explanation to this. It's not that we just observe these things to work. It's not that I just saw this happen one day and then I assume it happens the next day. Why, though? I understand that it does. I understand that the sun comes up every single day. But how can you give an account for that? And to argue the opposite is to be self-refuting. If you begin to argue that logic is merely a social construct, but you're using logic to argue that. So these are truths that are transcendent. So the other perspective may not like the way that we argue, but without what I'm saying here, without this transcendental idea, you cannot make sense out of anything. And I want to end with two quotes that are given. One is by Robert Jaskow, and it's from his book, The Enchanted Loom, The Mind of the Universe. And he says, for the scientist who has lived by faith and power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He scaled the mountain of ignorance he is about to conquer to the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. And the reason is because without this worldview, without an understanding of the transcendent, you cannot make sense out of even scientific laws. And the last quote comes from a book called The Devil's Delusion, which was published recently by a man named David Berlisky. And he asked the following question: has anyone provided proof of God's existence? Has anyone provided proof of God's inexistence? Not even close. Has quantum cosmology explained the emergence of the universe or why it is here? Not even close. Have the scientists explained why our universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for the existence of life? Not even close. Are physicists and biologists willing to believe in anything so long as it is not in religious thought? Close enough. Has rationalism and moral thought provided us with an understanding of what is good, what is right, and what is moral? Not close enough. Has secularism in the terrible 20th century been a force for good? Not even close to being close. Is there a narrow and oppressive orthodoxy of thought and opinion within the sciences? Close enough. Does anything in the sciences or in their philosophy justify their claim that religious belief is irrational? Not even in the ballpark. Is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Dead on. And this is written by a man who is a skeptic and, from what I can tell, is not a Christian. And I am 5 minutes over. Does anyone have a question? I recognize I said a lot, and I did not even say everything. Okay, well, we have about 10 to 15 minutes before worship starts.